Muted.
Teen Dating Violence and Prevention, Awareness and Prevention Month webinar series. What we've done this month is we've talked about, kind of in a progression of topics, we've talked about how to get involved in some of the violence prevention in Alaska, what some resources are, and now we're kind of looking at shared risk and protective factors. So I just wanted to say thank you for joining me. My name is Claudia Plesha. I am a project coordinator for the Alaska Network on Domestic Violence and Sexual Assault. And my work primarily is with youth. We do teen dating violence prevention. And so, that's not primarily what I'm here to talk to you about. I'm primarily here to talk to you about the links between different types of violence and why those links are so very important to the work that we do. We know that violence takes many forms. It includes intimate partner violence, it includes sexual violence, but it also includes child maltreatment, bullying, suicide, elder abuse, and neglect. And what research has found, and I think our communities have also known this for a long time, is that these forms of violence are interconnected and they often share the same roots. And so they can take place under one roof, in the same community, in the same household. Multiple types of violence can take place for people. And so understanding these overlapping causes of violence is really important to being able to address it in our communities. And so it's my hope that this presentation, combined with your own experiences and your knowledge of your own community, will help you as you think strategically about how you can prevent violence of all types, but then also coordinate responses to violence in a way that takes into account these connections. So this presentation is going to include an overview, a brief overview of the risk and protective factors that we, for the longest time, were seeking to find when we're doing teen dating violence prevention. And so what we're going to talk about after that is our discovery, which was that as we were digging deep into finding these risk and protective factors and asking for CDC to provide this research to us, the research that came out actually came out to say that there's these links that are extremely powerful. So I want to talk about those links as well in between the types of violence and for possible strategies as to how to address those links. And then because this work can be hard to think about at the community context, we're talking about research sort of at the high level, sometimes it can be hard for us to think about how to really address it in our own communities. So what I'm going to do next is I'm going to talk about some examples that have taken place in communities where they've addressed multiple types of violence, and they've really focused on partnering across the social ecological system, across agencies, across communities also, to impact these factors. So are there any questions so far? And I do want to say that you all are muted, and so I'll go ahead and unmute you now. If there's any questions, go ahead and So I apologize for that, folks. I actually muted myself, and I was having a pretty good conversation with myself there. Okay, I'm back. So, so I'm sorry, I was pulling up the presentation there as well. But so what I've started to talk about a little bit, and what I want to talk about first, is our work in teen dating violence prevention and our journey into kind of figuring out what the social landscape is for that. And what we realized that as we were digging in deeper, we're like that little penguin, you know? You're on top of the iceberg, and there's so much more underneath there to dig through. So when we were looking at the social landscape, we saw that we have extreme high rates both nationally and also here in Alaska. And this is for both sexual assault and teen dating violence. Our numbers are extremely high here in Alaska. Half of Alaskan women have experienced one or the other in their lifetime. And the reason why our focus is on teen dating violence was because it's a precursor for intimate partner violence. So you develop your attitudes and your beliefs about relationships when you're an adolescent. And additionally, the longer that unhealthy relationships go on, the more severe the health impacts are. And so the earlier that we intervene, the better it is. Now, how do we learn about relationships? How do we all come to an agreement as to what relationships should look like? Well, it's not as simple as us individually deciding what our relationships are going to look like. In fact, our relationships with others, our parents, and our peers have a huge influence on that. Our communities and our societies do as well. And so if we want to impact, and I use this model because us public health people really like models, but if we want to impact that last box, which is the romantic relationship quality, if we want to impact whether violence happens there or not, we actually want to go backwards and impact the perception, attitudes, and behaviors of both partners. However, if we just talk to those two individual people, we may not have the impact that we think we're going to have, because those perceptions, behaviors, and attitudes really come from the community, school, and peer context, as well as the society that we're part of. So what do you think are some risk factors for teen dating violence? And go ahead and type it into the chat box. So we see now, So let's think about some of these answers and think about whether an individual really has control over those. So an unhealthy relationship at home, that is definitely a risk factor for teen dating violence. Can youth impact the relationships that their homes have? Can they impact the relationships of their parents or their grandparents? Can they impact the relationships that they see? Not always, not really. Things for teenagers to do. It is not often in teenagers' control how many activities are present in their community. It's not in their control how many of those activities are positive, right? So these are things that are actually happening at the community level, at the societal levels even, right? Because if there's no funding within the schools in our societies for some of these things, okay, so we see that these kind of, exactly, so we see trauma play an important role. in whether you perpetrate or you become a victim of teen dating violence. And so you're at higher risk if you've experienced trauma, which none of us choose to experience trauma. We experience a higher risk for teen dating violence. And so these are all things that individuals always control. These are things that we can't impact by ourselves. And so when we look at risk factors, and as we work with populations, we have to think about the whole societal impact, the whole social ecological model to create a real impact. So here are what we have been able to find to be risk factors for teen dating violence. And I'll zoom in here in a little bit. But you all had a lot of the things that we see here. So we see that if there's a history of violent victimization, so if there's trauma that's taken place, we see that if there's exposure to conflict and violence in the family, that can be a risk factor. We also see that if parents don't have practices around discipline that are balanced, that are well balanced, they're either too harsh or they're not existent, or there's just low parental involvement, we see that that can be a risk factor. And so we also looked at, okay, so we can't just look at individual and family risk factors. What are some other things that we can impact at the peer and community level? And so we see that if you're rejected by your peers, if you have low academic performance, if there's lack of involvement in conventional activities, so you all talked about that too. If there's not very much for me to do, I'm at higher risk of developing unhealthy behaviors in my relationship. So a lot of us in prevention then said, okay, awesome, well, now we kind of know what somebody might be at risk for, but what are some of those protective factors? What are some things that we can promote that are positive, that can really help? And the CDC took a little bit longer to find this research. It was harder to find why some people were resilient while others were not. However, we've been able to narrow down some individual protective and some family protective factors that can help. And it's important that it is not always, they're not always opposite. So a risk factor may not have a protective factor on the other side necessarily. However, there's some really good things that we can promote through our programming. And so if you are involved in school, that can really help. If you have social skills, that can help. And how can that impact violence? Well, we'll talk about that in a little bit. If you have an ability to plan for your future, that can help you feel more positive, better about yourself. And then you're more protective against teen dating violence. We also see that if your family has coping mechanisms for dealing with problems, we see that if there's shared activities with parents, and if you're involved in social activities, that can also help. And the same thing, so pro-social activities, that is definitely something that can help protect someone, but it's happening at the community level. So it's not something an individual can control, but it helps. We also know that the school climate can play a huge role in this. If there's intense supervision, if there's behavioral rules that make sense, if we have negative reinforcements for aggression, and if we work with both parents and teachers, then that can also help. So while we're doing this research, what we found is that we had a lot in common with lots of other types of violence, lots of other experiences of violence. And I'll zoom in here in a little bit. But we found that there was these things that we all had in common. And so in some ways, we were replicating the work. But why is it that across these types of violence, we see, so first let's look at some of these things that are extremely positive that can help. So when we look at intimate partner violence, teen dating violence, protective factors at the relationship level, so that piece in the middle, is nearly identical to the protective factors that can help protect somebody from bullying and suicide. Nearly identical. And so as we were doing this work, we realized that there were these connections there. And so does it make sense then for us to be siloed in the same way that we have been when we're doing this work, if in a sense we're actually promoting the same things? And so I won't zoom into this. There's kind of a lot there. What they found for risk factors is that there's a lot more in common. They found a lot more risk factors than they were able to find protective factors in common. So why exactly is that? Why is it that when we're experiencing different kind of violence, we have a similar reaction? Well, it comes down to one word, and Helen has actually already said it, and it's in our chat box there, and that's trauma. So when we look at how the body and brain reacts to violence, it doesn't matter what kind of violence it is, we have similar reactions. So when children grow up in safe, stable, nurturing environments, we know that they learn empathy, we learn that they learn anger management, problem-solving skills, and all of these things help protect against violence. When children don't grow up in an environment that's stable or an environment that feels safe, they form different connections with each other. And those connections are a survival mechanism. Those connections help those children better recognize and respond to threats. And so we see that these fight and flight responses are really helpful in that moment. However, in the long run, if children are living in a threatening environment, a continuous environment that is threatening, their flight and fight responses can sometimes actually override other positive skills that they have for responding nonviolently. So we're born in with these skills, and we need those skills, and we respond to them in a type of, when we experience trauma or violence. However, if the trauma is ongoing, then we stop being able to tell when to respond in that way. And so this study that looked at adverse childhood experiences told us that exact thing. When we see that somebody's experienced child abuse or neglect or some kind of violence, we know that the short-term and the short and long-term outcomes include more than just teen dating violence, but it includes alcoholism, depression, drug use, suicide. And the more adverse childhood experiences we have, the more at risk we are for these additional health problems. And so that's why we see these common threads between the types of violence. And what else? Why else is it really important to think about this? And why else do we see, why else is it important to think of things in this way? Because if we only think about individual risk and protective factors, we can only impact so many people at a time. But if we're able to work together and impact community risk and protective factors, we can protect groups of people all at once. And so we can change how norms in the society are around violence, promote those protective factors, and we can see that then that trickles down to the individual level. But it's important to know what those community contexts are and also what some of those risk factors are that are unique to that community. And also when we look at violence, and it doesn't matter what type of violence we're looking at, we know that survivors of one type of violence are more likely to be victims of another. And so if we prevent bullying, if we also help those people that are doing the bullying prevention in our communities, we can in some sense also prevent other forms of violence. Okay. Are there any questions so far? That was kind of a lot of information. All right. So violence perpetuates itself. If something started out as bullying, it could end up impacting someone's life so that it shows up as intimate partner violence. And so it's important for us to address these multiple types of violences in our communities and know what that looks like so that we can actually address that. And also do the work around the teen dating violence piece, which many of us are involved in. So here's a few side notes that I would like to say. Not all risk factors and protective factors are alike. So as we look across all of these sort of dots or check marks that are in these charts, we know that the impact of a risk factor or a protective factor is not alike, and especially when we look at a community. And so when you're doing your work, and we'll talk about a model that can help you kind of do this, I want you to think about your community. So what are the risk factors in your community, and what are the things in your community that can help mitigate that? So I want you to adapt this to make it work with your community. Additionally, we know that not all risk and protective factors are changeable. So I've already experienced violence. That puts me at risk of further violence. Can I change that? Cannot. So some things we cannot change in our communities. Some things we can only plan around and hopefully prepare the people that we're working with to make our communities more resilient when future violence may occur or future stress may occur. But not all of those things are changeable. So we have to mitigate trauma sometimes, and we also have to think about moving forward and positive strategies once trauma has already occurred. In addition, risk and protective factors are additive. And so the more risk factors we have, the more impacted we are at risk to be. Additionally, the more protective factors we have, the better it is. So here's a model, and I don't know exactly why this model was, or this text was capitalized, maybe because it's important, I don't know, but it's pasted over all capitalized. But developing a prevention strategy, here's some steps that can help you think through how to use this information in your community. So first, like I said earlier, it's important to think about what risk factors are present in your community, so gathering data on that, and what protective factors are present in your community. Now, after we kind of know where our communities are at for risk and protective factors, it's then important to think about which ones are more or less important, which ones have more impact in our communities, but then also which ones are changeable, which ones are feasible with the resources that we have, and which ones have the broadest impact. So if you can only focus on one, which one should you focus on? If you only have so much time, what is possible to do? And if there's some things we cannot change, how do we mitigate that? How do we deal with that in our community? Additionally, the next step would be to find support in the community. So if you see these links, then other people will see them too. And there's lots of people in your community that are doing this work. So I realized when I was kind of looking at that model, the social ecological model, and also that chart that looked at shared risk and protective factors, I don't know if you were thinking like, oh my gosh, is she asking me to now work on bullying and suicide and teen dating violence and also across all of these levels? In a sense, maybe, if you think that's possible. But what I'm also saying is that now we've brought more hands to the work. We've brought more support from the community because we're all doing the same work. And so finding that support may actually be easier because our strategy is now including more than one thing that we're impacting. Additionally, it is important to evaluate what we're doing in our communities so that we can make those adjustments as we implement our programming, and also to share our findings and get additional resources. So building in evaluation so that you can show others what your program has done or what your work has done is really, really important. And sharing your findings is also really important, especially as we all apply for funding and especially as we all work towards sort of making the work that we're doing sustainable in our community. So it doesn't just end after we're gone, or it doesn't just end when the project is over. So those are the steps for thinking through and using this information to create a prevention strategy. So do folks have questions so far? What do you think, how do you think that you'll actually use this in your work? Is going to try to get more support for teen dating violence prevention by tying it into other works from different areas. So Swarupa says connecting the dots and connecting positive adults to the youth that we're working with so that that impact can actually carry over. Because we saw that that positive adult can be such a huge influence for all of those types of violence as we went across that chart. So for me, when I think about how I use this in my work, when I think about funding and when I think about getting support for my work, it's becoming increasingly difficult to find funding that makes sense and that fully supports the work that we're doing in all of its aspects. And so we've recently started partnering with other organizations because we're doing the same thing, we're impacting the same factors to apply for funding. And so that's made a difference. And so one of the pots of funding that we applied for was suicide prevention. So how do we actually make this happen in the community? What does it look like when we address more than one type of violence? And I'd like to give you some examples from the community, from the communities that we work in. So in Homer, we had a group of teens that really wanted to impact teen dating violence in their communities. And they ran into the same discoveries that we did. How do we impact teen dating violence when there's all these other things going on? If you're depressed, if you have anxiety, if you don't have good coping mechanisms, if we don't have that as a community, if we're not resilient, then we're going to respond to violence with more violence, and we're also not going to take care of the basic needs of the people that we're trying to impact. So if we're not taking care of the basic needs of the individual in that relationship, if they don't feel mentally supported, if they don't have those pieces that make them resilient, then how could we then impact the quality of their relationship? And so they wanted to increase resiliency in their community. So resiliency is defined as a set of inner resources, social competencies, and cultural strategies that permit individuals to not only survive, but recover and even thrive after stressful events, but also to draw from the experience to enhance subsequent functioning. So they wanted to know, violence is happening at high levels already. How do we deal with those pieces first so that it doesn't turn into further violence? And so what they wanted to do, and here's a quote that I found, it's obvious that children will work harder and do things, even odd things, like adding fractions for people they love and trust. So what they wanted to do was they wanted to increase connection in their community between folks that were supportive. And they also wanted to take a strengths-based approach. So they wanted to bring in speakers that supported positive coping mechanisms. Now within this model, and this is their program here, within this model, you see that most of these, so these are the speakers. We see that within this model and at this presentation, there wasn't much conversation around teen dating violence. There was more conversation around coping, around positive skills for what to do with ourselves, how to find those strengths that have made us resilient and that allow us to survive those very stressful situations and then move past them and thrive. So those were the things that they wanted to promote. And they were able to partner up with mental health agencies and organizations in their communities. They were able to partner with youth. And they were also able to partner with artists and storytellers to kind of get this to happen. So are there any questions about this event that took place? And there's also a video as well, but I think it might be kind of hard to get it to play on here, so I do encourage all of you to find the Bonfire on the Bay promotional video and hear what the youth are talking about there. So another approach that was taken by another one of our partners is the I Am campaign in Sitka. So this was developed with the Sitka Youth Leadership Committee, and it connects youth across Alaska, but then also celebrates strengths that youth bring to the table. Let's see if this might play. We'll try it. So that video and that campaign, the I Am campaign, are all about promoting those positive things that youth already have that make them resilient, and also creating more resiliency by highlighting the things that youth have, but then also by connecting them to one another so that youth feel powerful together. And so what does it really mean for our work then to have this information, to have this knowledge? Well, I believe that understanding risk and protective factors of violence, the shared ones, can help us prevent these multiple forms of violence at once. Violence prevention really should happen across multiple connected forms of violence and to increase the public health impact of those prevention efforts. So for example, if we work with organizations that work on youth maltreatment or suicide, we could strategize together on strategies that increase family connectedness and therefore impact the whole community without doing separate projects, without splitting up our resources. Additionally, I also believe that it'll help us to recognize the potential impacts and move backwards when we have a family that's experiencing violence. So it will allow us to actually work with the entire family and coordinate our efforts and coordinate with schools and also with the communities so that everyone is receiving help and that the impact is actually ongoing, not just something that we provide for the youth for a couple of hours a week, but that we actually change their whole environment. And I do know that there is still a purpose in addressing the unique aspects of violence, but I do think it's important to think about supporting joint action whenever possible. And so understanding these links then is our first step to coordinating strategies, activities, and resources and effectively really impact these different forms of violence. And so this could look like blended funding streams like they talked about earlier, but then also collaboration between partners and organizations. So I believe that together we can make a difference in preventing all types of violence. And as one of the youth that we work with said, I believe that if we work across all of these levels, what she wanted to see as an elder, she wanted to see a world in which she learned the cycle of salmon, not the cycle of violence. And so I believe that working across all these types of violence, and I believe by impacting multiple risk and protective factors and creating creative partnerships, we can have this impact in our work. So, but I do want to hear your ideas. What are some things that you think that you'll be able to do? What are some creative partnerships that you think you could create within your own community? So partnership with schools. A lot of the time they're much more hesitant to have us come to the schools, or they limit the work that we do to, safe or unsafe touch, which is also important. But if we say that we're also impacting bullying, and we can show the links, the clear links between our program and a risk factor for bullying, then I believe that we can enter the schools in a much better way and impact the ages that we don't often have access to. Okay. So there's local youth servicing agencies, and they're all kind of siloed. They're doing suicide work. They might be doing intervention, and they may not be able to have resources for prevention, and they would love to be able to partner with a ANDVSA agency and sort of think about impacting them through that prevention work, but not necessarily always. So most agencies don't have resources for prevention. If we do, that's something that we can bring to the table And I think that if we create the links between the forms of violence, then local youth servicing agencies are going to see that value. So that's a great point, Helen. So partnering with churches. One of the biggest things about churches is that they work with the entire family, right? They want family wellness. It's one of the things that most churches strive to provide to their members. And so if we say, hey, look at these things that we can all work together on, and we have these similar goals, and actually the result will also be similar, then I believe that they can be a strong partner to us. That's a good point, Tiffany. So, like I said, this information can be pretty broad and it's kind of large scale. However, I want to encourage all of you to take it and apply it to your communities. You know, and you can find out where risk factors are in your communities much better than others. You can also figure out, whoa, my community is extremely connected. That's something that we can use to protect ourselves from trauma. How do we use that in a positive way? And I also think that there's a lot of work with both youth and families that are going on. And so if we can have some of our partners do some of our work for us, or if we can do some of their work for us, then more of the entire community will be impacted. Awesome. Well, I just want to say thank you for all of you for listening to me for an hour here. I am very passionate about doing violence prevention work, and I believe that it's very possible, especially as we have more and more resources, and especially as we partner across our communities. So I want to encourage you to use these resources here that you see on your screen. We see that there are some violence prevention resources, and I also want to encourage you to reach out to me as well, because I am passionate about helping you use these resources. I am passionate about helping you think through how to include your community's information into these resources. So, so thank you again for your passion as well, and do not hesitate to reach out to us. Thank you.